Hi there, it's Melody with Oyes Real Estate, here to talk to you about short sale processing. Today we're going to talk about the listing period and the process for getting the value back. We're about 45 to 60 days into the process at this point. If you have not been contacted by an appraiser, you need to call the lender and find out why not. You need to escalate and make sure that you're contacted as soon as possible. You do not want this to drag out. It takes about 7 to 14 days to get the value back once the BPO or the appraiser has gone out. The next 7 to 14 days is the lender reviewing the report, they're determining the value so they can release the value to you. You definitely want to call the lender as much as possible until you know what that value is. So the approved value, I like to call this the halfway point. Everything's downhill from here, more or less, but knowing the value is really important so you can start negotiating the offers. You need to find out when this value is going to expire. In the previous slides, we talked about the different types of loan and how long the values are good for. This comes into effect right now because you need to get the exact date on when this value is going to expire. You also want to get a copy of the BPO or the appraisal report. As an agent, it's very helpful that we get this report so we can put it on our MLS and advertise that this property is already appraised. Here's the value. You may need to counter the buyer at this point. You had an original offer to begin with, so if their offer is lower than this approved value, you will need to counter them. If the buyer decides to walk, saying that that value is too much for them, that's okay. You need to put the property back on the market, and I like to put in my MLS approved price. So all the agents know that we're already at this approved price. It's all downhill from here, more or less, and that their buyers are on board at this price. You may have backup offers as well, so you want to reach out to those backup offers and let them know that the previous buyer walked and the bank is looking for this price value and see if they're interested. If you get the value back and it makes no sense, the comps that you pulled and the information that you have and that value don't match, then you can submit what's called a value dispute. Value disputes are lengthy and in-depth, and we'll go into that. But basically, if a bad value comes back, you're not going to be able to sell the property. Everybody's going to be dead in the water. The bank, your seller, yourself for putting in the work, you're not going to be able to sell this property if there's a bad value. So when that happens, you can submit a value dispute. Now, you're going to have to call the lender and ask them, what documents do you need for a value dispute? More or less, this is what you're going to need. Some lenders require 6 comps versus 3 comps, but in general, you will have to provide 3 sold comps, typically within the last 6 months. And they have to be comparable to your subject property. So that's square footage, number of rooms, year built, things of that nature. If you're doing a house that was sold 13 years ago, obviously the bank's not going to take that into consideration. So just be smart in what you're submitting and make sure that it's realistic and accurate. You also want to provide repair bids, and any buyer that you're working with, if they feel that the value is too high as well, they're going to be able to provide you these repair bids. They're going to go and get those done for you. You also need to provide color photos of the damages. Now, if you can work with me here, go back to one of our very first videos. We talked about going and meeting the seller and taking pictures. When you're taking those pictures, that's when you want to get the good and the bad. I always suggest get 2 pictures of the bad. Let's say there's a hole in the drywall. I like to get a close-up, and then I also like to take a few steps back and get a picture overall of where this damage is. So you're going to have 2 pictures of every damage to be able to submit back to the lender. You also need to compose a letter of explanation of why you're submitting this value dispute. Why do you think that this value is unrealistic and unjustified? You want to include information like how many days on market the property has been, how many showings there have been, any feedback from the showings that agents have left, and an inspection report if the buyer has it. Now, just a little side note, HUD insured loans, once they pick their value, it is very hard to dispute. they just stick by the appraisal, because with conventional loans, they order a BPO, so there's a little bit of flexibility. But with HUD insured loans, they order the appraisal, and since the appraisal is super extensive, they stick by that value. Not saying that it can't be done, but don't get your feelings hurt if they don't approve the value dispute on a HUD insured loan. So here's an example that I have for you guys for my value dispute letter. You need to always put the seller's name, reference the property address and the loan number, date it, who it's to. I kind of go into a little bit of history about the property. The key things that you definitely want to include in your valuation dispute letter is the average days on market in the neighborhood. So for example, on this one, the average days to sell a house in this neighborhood was 11.5 days. I mean, and that's sold, like listed, sold, and closed within 11 days. The property, this subject property, has been on the market for 64 days. So obviously right then and there, something's wrong. The market is telling us that this property in this value is not good. I also like to put in the comps, the low end and the high end. Again, you can get comps from your agent or Propelio. You also want to provide a CMA, the comparative market analysis, to show the low end and the high end. I go into details about what repairs are needed, and I list the cost of those repairs. I also like to include that these repairs, this price of the repairs, either does or does not include like paint, carpet, and new flooring. A lot of lenders will say that they do not care about paint and carpet. They won't consider that because it's cosmetic or lipstick. That really the main things that they're looking for to dispute the value, or a reason for them to want to reduce the value, is going to be major issues like foundation, roof, electrical, plumbing, pool. This one had a bad case of termites, so that's important to mention. So basically you're justifying why the value needs to be reduced. And I also like to bring up the fact that there's possible code violations. Just lay it on thick what all the issues are for this property. And then I like to reiterate the value that I think they should have. So in my letter here, I'm saying, please take all this information when considering the current offer of $100,000. That last sentence is leaving them with the value that I think it should be. So I want that value to linger and resonate. And then I also like to, let them know that I'm attaching photos, repair bids, comps, and the market analysis. And then you're basically going to build your comprehensive packet into one and send it in. Well, the results from the value dispute, once you submit this, it's going to take the lender another 2 to 4 weeks to make a decision on your value dispute. The lenders can either send the valuation dispute to their actual valuation department that they have within the company, or they can send it back to the original BPO or appraiser that originally did the valuation to begin with. So that's what takes time, is for them to review everything. So once they've reviewed everything and made a decision, they're going to do one of two things. The bank's going to say, yes, we will come down on the price, and they're going to verbally give you the new value. Or they're going to reject it and say, nope, we're sticking by our original value. That's what's going to happen, one of those two things. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to submit another value dispute right after that if it's the same buyer and get different results. You can't just keep submitting the same things and expect different results. The only way that you possibly could do that is if the buyer says, okay, if you're countering me, I'll counter you back. And then you provide more documents. So if you weren't able to submit an inspection report now, maybe the buyer's willing to pay for an inspection report now. And then you're submitting new documents with a higher offer. That is something that you can do. Honestly, a lot of the times, if you're submitting value disputes back to back to back, the lenders are just going to keep rejecting it. They're just going to say, no, put it on the market and market it for this price. We want to see if we can get top value. Because you got to remember, the bank is taking a loss. So when they come up with that value and you're just automatically disputing it, they're probably not going to appreciate that. Because they do want to minimize their loss. So they're going to list it high and want you to market it. It's a tug of war with these banks with dealing with these values. But if enough time has elapsed and there are no offers, that's only going to justify the fact that that price is too high. So then you could actually resubmit your value dispute days later. I usually say wait about 30 days before you submit another value dispute. During this time, I have it on the market. I have it listed at the approved price. If I get in less offers, I'm actually going to submit those offers to show the bank saying, hey, look, this is what the market is giving me, lower offers, and they're going to probably reject those offers. Hey, maybe they will accept one, but more than likely they're not going to. So after you've done that and the 30 days has elapsed, then I would go back and resubmit a value dispute. Maybe you have a new buyer, you can go back to your original buyer and try again if you really honestly think that that value is too high. And then, of course, ultimately the bank is going to stick to their value. Whether they flat out say no to your value dispute, or if they accept it, the value dispute, and come down, you can't just keep disputing the value to get it down to the price that, you know, is really silly. It has to be realistic. So the bank will ultimately put their foot down and say, we have to have this amount. And that's what you're going to have to list it at. Okay, so you have the approved value, you've done a value dispute, you've actually got the bank to say, this is the final price that we're going to agree to. You say, okay, I understand. Now, from there, you are required to net a specific amount from this approved value. And I think this is where a lot of people get confused, perhaps a lot of investors, maybe even agents. You hear questions that say, well, I think there's this mathematical equation to what the bank will accept versus their payoff. That's not true. It all depends on the appraised value. That's what the bank is going to want. If the house, you know, is only worth $100,000, but they owe $300,000, the bank understands they're only going to accept and take what the current value is. So there's no mathematical equation in that aspect. But there is an equation to say that they have to net a certain amount from that appraised value. So with conventional loans, they want to net 88 of the appraised value. So really simple, if the value is $100,000, the bank says the approved value is $100,000, we know for a conventional loan that they need to net 88%, so that would be $88,000. And the $88,000 comes into play because of all the closing costs that are associated with the seller's loan. There's taxes, maybe HOAs, commission, settlement fee, things of that nature. So the closing costs minus the value has to equal the 88%. So with the reverse mortgage, they want to net anywhere from 90 to 95. This is case by case because I've seen it on a broad spectrum. Some banks will take 90%, others will take 95. So you need to ask the bank what percentage or what net will you accept. With reverse mortgages, since they want to net so much, I've actually had to increase my sales price, the approved value, to cover the closing costs so we can net this 90 to 95%. So once you get the value and you know the net, you need to have your title company make you a HUD so you can see all the fees and what you can actually sell this house for to meet that required net. A HELOC loan is also 90%. Again, case by case, you really just need to ask the lender what their net requirement is. A VA loan is usually 88%, but again, just double check with the lender to confirm. Sometimes with VA loans, they just give you a net. They just flat out say, we want a net 88%. So then you can go to your title company and say, hey, make me a HUD with all these fees, and then you'll know what you actually need to list the property at. USDA loans, 88%, again, case by case. And HUD insured loans, there's a whole other slide for this one, but just an overall recap. It's 88% for the first 30 days, 86% for the next 30 to 60 days, and after that, they will take a minimum of 84% net. A side note, the seller incentive is not going to affect this net. So let's go back to our example where the value is $100,000. They have to net 88%, so that would be $88,000. If the seller incentive is bringing that $88,000 down, that's okay. The bank will accept it. The seller incentive will not affect the net. The net can be lower because of the seller incentive, and that's the only reason why. It can't be lower for any other reason. So again, you may have to increase your sales price. You really need to work with your title company and get a HUD to figure out all the fees and liens and make sure that you meet that required net. So for HUD insured loans, when we're dealing with the approved value, HUD is going to issue what's called an ATP. It's an approval to participate. It lays out the terms of the short sale. It's going to lay out the approved value, the deadline to obtain the offer, and then it's going to lay out the net. So again, 0 to 30 days, or 1 to 30 days, you're going to need to net 88%. 31 to 60 days, they will accept 86%. And then 60 to 120 days, they will take 84%. It's very rare that the banks will take 84%. You have to do a lot of teeth pulling with them to get them. Even though HUD says they will accept it, for some reason, it's just a lot harder for them to accept the 84%. But work with the lender, negotiate, and if the bottom line is 84%, you can push them to get that accepted. Also in the ATP, you need to make sure that the seller is bringing zero money to closing. This is something that you will need to read thoroughly and understand this ATP, read it line for line, and make sure that the seller is not required to bring any money to closing. This is in reference to the promissory note back in the very first video that we did about the negative impacts to the seller, is that they may require the seller to sign a promissory note. And this is where that amount would be, is in the ATP. So it's going to get a little bit tricky here, so hang with me. The ATP that we just discussed is if there is no foreclosure date set and there's not one in sight. You will get a 120-day ATP. However, if first legal has been filed, your ATP now has to be buyer specific, where you have to have an offer submitted that meets the required net, and then HUD will issue you an ATP that has the buyer's name in it. So if that's the case and the buyer walks after you've gotten the buyer-specific ATP, the lender's actually going to shut down the short sale, and you can only restart the short sale if you have another buyer that meets their required net. So this is very delicate, especially since first legal has already been filed. There's a higher chance that if that buyer walks, you could be looking in foreclosure. So work with that buyer, let them know the risk that they're putting the seller in by walking after they submit their contract. You always want to push the lender to get the ATP. I have to call the bank and say, hey, have you submitted the request to HUD for the ATP? I mean, you're always babysitting the bank, but as long as you know the next steps, you can push them and you will be successful. So push the lender to get the ATP with HUD insured loans. So here's an example of an ATP. The most important things to look for in this ATP is one, the date. The top right-hand corner, it's going to show the date. They will require the homeowner to sign this, again, a wet signature. And this has to be signed, dated, and returned within 10 calendar days of this being issued to you. So the seller has to sign this within 10 days of it being issued. If you kind of look towards the middle, the first highlighted part on the left shows the approved value, which is $100,000. The deadline to obtain an offer is June 12th. So this one was issued in April, and they're only giving us a month to find an offer. And the net that they have to meet is down here on the bottom left of $88,000. This is an old ATP, I apologize, but on the top right-hand section where it says relocation services, this is where they would insert for the promissory note. So just be sure, again, to read every line of this ATP and understand it before you have the seller sign and agree to it. And then the bottom portion, bottom right-hand portion, will show the amount of the seller incentive. I do want to mention that the approved value and the ATP expiration date are two different dates. So when you're dealing with a HUD insured loan, you need to make sure that you know when the approved value expires and when the ATP expires. That's very important. If you are working an offer that meets the approved value and you know it's about to expire, ask the lender for an extension. It's very important that you don't lose that value, because what could happen is the value expires, they're going to have to order a new appraisal and a new BPO, meaning the value could actually come back in higher than the previous one you just had, which would ruin your deal. So you don't want that to happen. Vice versa, if you have a high value and you're not able to sell it and the value is about to expire, let it expire so you can get a new appraisal ordered or a new BPO, so in hopes that the value will come down. So remember, the value for HUD insured loans will expire a different day that the ATP will expire. I hope you found this informational, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.